And you're trying to give the young people something that will help them, yet you don't know exactly what it ought to be.
Hello again, this is Drew Perkins, and welcome back to the Teach Thought Podcast. I am your host, and I'm also the Director of Teach Thought Professional Development. As always, I'd like to invite you to visit our website, which is wegrowteachers.com, to check out our professional development services. All of our work is focused through the lens of inquiry, and project-based learning, differentiated instruction, and inquiry are the mainstays of the work that we do, but there you'll find some other pieces of work that we also engage in and help schools with. On the matter of project-based learning, I'm excited to let you know that registration is indeed open for our PBL Grow 23 event that has been on hiatus for a couple of years due to COVID. We'll be hosting that in our home base of Louisville, Kentucky, June 26th through 28th at a very cool venue. And we've just recently added a new keynote speaker that I think will be interesting. That event is meant to be an open registration workshop for individuals and small groups who are interested in learning more about project-based learning. So we use our Foundations of PBL workshop to help you understand and create a project for implementation with your classroom. School leaders, of course, would be creating a project that would be related to their work as school leaders. You can find more information about that at wegrowteachers.com/grow23. Early bird registration will be ending here in a few days from the recording of this podcast, but of course we'll have registration open for quite some time. Also on the matter of project-based learning, we'll be publishing a blog piece talking about the 5 phases of project-based learning with a hopefully helpful new graphic. You can find that again on wegrowteachers.com in the blog section under the PBL category. As always, we appreciate any shares, likes, reviews, and those kinds of things with regards to the podcast. It helps us build our audience and hopefully helps teachers and educators around the world better prepare students for the modern world. In this episode, I spoke with John Basset and Gary Shiffman, who are the founders of 4QM, which is the 4-question method, and authors of an accompanying book called From Story to Judgment, the 4-question method for teaching and learning social studies. The 4 questions that they use as a framework are question 1, what happened? Question 2, what were they thinking? Question 3, why then and there? And then question 4, what do we think about that? And I don't think the simplicity of that framework belies the ways in which a framework like this can really help social studies teachers grow the thinking of and the inquiry skills of our students. So, of course, as an advocate for inquiry, I had lots of questions, and we talked a bit about some of the ways in which it builds upon the work of the Understanding by Design model, as well as the C3 social studies frameworks, but at least in their opinion, and I don't necessarily disagree, can help us build upon those in ways that actually bring more impact and better thinking about social studies content. So again, we talked about essential questions and an analytical teacher mind and the idea that I talk about with pull and push teaching and some of the ways in which the framework can be used to get what's in students' heads out so we can correct it and or build upon it, and the ways in which this leans back into what I would say are our American constitutional ideals of liberal science and building upon the work of Jonathan Rauch, of which I've written about in a blog piece that I mentioned as well. We also talk about the false dichotomy between direct and explicit instruction and inquiry, and when you combine the two and using a method like this, it can really yield really wonderful thinking and results in the thinking of our students. So again, I think it's a really useful framework for social studies teachers and very likely for non-social studies teachers to even think about. So I hope you find this helpful. John and Gary, nice to have you on the podcast. You want to say hello to everybody and maybe give a bit of background on who you are and maybe how you came to where you are with the four question method and the work that you're doing. But yeah, let's start with you, John, just because you're on my left, and then Gary, you're on my right. Give you a little opportunity to say hello and give your elevator pitch of who you are.
Sure. Well, Drew, we're really happy to be here. Thanks for having us. So I'm John Basset. I've been a history teacher for over 30 years. And in the early 2000s, I got the opportunity to hire a bunch of teachers in the suburban school where I was the head of the history department. And I got to hire four teachers that year. And the fourth guy I hired was Gary Shiffman. And Gary came into high school teaching from academia. He's a PhD in political theory, and hired him. And then he took me out for a beer that summer and just started hammering at me. Why are we even teaching history anyway? And what are we doing when we do that? And I was like, who is this guy? And that started a 10-year plus argument that has been really, really fruitful and led us to the four question method, which we'll talk more about, obviously. But Gary, you want to tell your side of the story?
Sure. I'm Gary Shiffman. I am now a high school teacher and administrator. I work at Brookline High School near Boston. John happened to be a student there back in the day, graduated in 84. My wife graduated in 1980, so life is weird. Anyway, so John hired me in 2002 to be a high school teacher, and I found a way to sublimate my unhappiness at the fact that I was 39 and didn't know what the hell I was doing in the classroom. I was trying to teach ninth graders and trying to figure out how to get them interested in what I knew and what I wanted them to know, and I honestly didn't know how to do it. So as John was teaching me how to be a history teacher, I was fighting with him about why are we doing this in the first place? And as John said, that turned out to be incredibly productive. I spent 4 years at Newton North High School, then came to Brookline High School and become a department chair. And I've been worrying about that stuff ever since. I hire new teachers and I think, what do they need to know? And I think we now have an answer. The answer is the four question method. They need to know that these are the four questions that drive inquiry in our field, make kids smarter if you do it right. They answer your questions about what to plan and how to teach. And now we're on the road trying to convince other people it's a good idea.
Well, lots of threads to pull on that are, I guess, resonant with me. I was a social studies teacher. I taught for 15 years. Started off in special ed because I couldn't find a social studies job at that point, but then moved into the regular education classroom, middle and then high school, and lots of different ways. As you know, you all know, there's lots of different social studies kinds of courses, and I taught probably most of them. I guess there's probably a few that I didn't. My mom was a teacher and was actually my social studies teacher, and I desperately tried not to be one of those. My grandmother actually was as well. I won't bore listeners again with the story about all that, but one of the things that you say, at least in the first part of the book or first chapter of the book, is that you think social studies teachers is the, I guess, hardest and most important job in schools. And I am really curious about, if you think, number one, Gary, like you were talking, well, both of you were talking about, like, why are we teaching this history stuff? And that resonates with me a little bit in sense that, like, I was a social studies teacher, but a political science major, and have almost always felt like we teach history in a bizarre way of sort of like linear sets of facts or maybe themes and things like that. But from a sort of government, I taught government in that political science dynamic of like, why is this important kind of thing? What's the relevance and why did it happen? And learning history seems most relevant to me in sense of like, we make better decisions if we're better informed, better understand the complexity and nuance and that kind of thing. And I wonder, do you have any sort of sense or intuition that social studies teachers in general have a disposition towards inquiry that's either unique or different or more valuable, or I guess, how does that kind of thinking land with you, either of you?
So,
Go ahead, John.
Yeah. So, Drew, you sort of recapped the first big argument that we had. And to date, the only one that I've actually won. Gary's won all the subsequent arguments. But the argument that we started with, Gary started in as a political theory PhD who likes to brag that he hasn't taken a history course since high school, and except for one cross-reference course in his grad program, this is true. So he came in teaching history, but with a political science background. And his point was that the stories that we're telling kids don't really matter. They need to know underlying principles about how the world works because we're focused on the present, and that's why we do this. And my counter argument was that underlying principles are boring and stories are not boring, and that kids live in a place and they need to know the story of their community, their country, and how it relates to the rest of the world, and that's in fact the way in to getting to that kind of present day wisdom that you're asking about. And so like I said, this is the only argument that I won, and our first question is what happened, because we always start with a story.
And by the way, so let me say that John was right about that. The reason I relented in the first place was because I tried teaching general principles to students, and it's really hard. It turns out that if you don't know anything, a general theory of anything is really not only dull but incomprehensible. You can't have a theory of revolutions until you know what a revolution is. And so you got to really study at least one of them before you start making up general theories. You can't have a theory of when wars break out or how they resolve unless you've studied one or two of them. And it turns out, so let's fast forward to today. I just looked at one of your podcasts, the one with Emily Hanford, Natalie Wexler, who we know well. She's one of our advisors. The argument of the science of reading, folks, is that if you don't know anything, you can't comprehend what you're reading. And I believe that's right. You may have the mechanics to decode the words and sound them out, but if you have no idea what they refer to, you're lost. And I discovered that the hard way in the classroom. I realized that I have to backfill everything to get to the point where we can theorize about, under what conditions do we get a revolution or a civil war, whatever we're interested in, right? And so over time, I became convinced John is right. First of all, kids need to know things to think about anything. There's no skill practice without knowledge. And the second thing is, and Dan Willingham is the great side on this, you have to tell stories if you want it to stick. Kids love stories. We all love stories. I mean, cultures transmit their knowledge. They transmit their wisdom with or without writing by telling stories that stick. So Drew, Cinderella, glass slipper, pumpkin, right? So I just screwed it up already. If I said to you pumpkin glass slipper, you know that story, right?
Yes.
Right. So Pumpkin Glass Slipper is a vivid reminder of a story, and we could play the game right now. You got a minute. Can you tell the story?
Can I tell the story of Cinderella?
Yeah. We didn't rehearse this.
Right.
For the audience at home, we didn't practice this at all.
My daughters are 14 and 16, so they're a bit removed from the Cinderella story, but right, a downtrodden stepdaughter who sort of finds the promised land and glory, at least temporarily. And I'm not even remembering honestly the very ending of it, but some sort of redemption, right? There's some sort of moral lesson.
She marries some guy,
right? The marries a prince, right?
Yeah. Glass slipper.
Yeah.
So the point is, in history, like imagine you have a student and you taught them the civil rights movement. You see him a year later. You see him 10 years later and you say, Montgomery, Birmingham. And they say, oh, story of Martin Luther King. Starts with the Montgomery bus boycott. It becomes a national figure. And by Birmingham, there are fire hoses and he's going to jail. He's writing a letter that changes American political thought. Our goal with students is to teach them stuff. And the form we teach them, in which we teach them, is storytelling. And the skill we practice is narration. They tell the story back. And if you do that, you create a base of knowledge in our field. And when kids have a base of knowledge, when anyone has a base of knowledge, then when you get to, under what conditions do social movements succeed? Under what conditions do social movements happen? Then they're like, oh, social movements. King? Like King? Oh, I get it. Like King.
Yeah, the key is you have to build to the general from the specific, and so the story is your grounding, and then you can get to the other three questions. Once kids know what happened, then you can pick out some interesting people in the story, and you can ask, hey, wait a minute, what were they thinking when they made those decisions? That's question 2. We're going to interpret the past, and then from there you can go to your generalizing questions. Why then and there? Why did this story happen in this place in this time, not another place or an earlier or later time? And what do we think about that? who do we admire in this story? Who do we not admire in this story? And why, what values do we hold that lead us to those judgments? So the questions start specific. What happened? What were they thinking? They move to more general. Why then and there? What do we think about that? And the goal is always that present day wisdom, Drew, that you started us with, which is we teach this so that kids can have wisdom to make better decisions, more informed decisions in the present. Which doesn't mean people are going to agree. It doesn't mean our students are going to make the same decisions. That's indoctrination, not education. It means that they're going to be thoughtful about the decisions that they make, and they're going to be able to build them from knowledge of human experience. And that's really what we're about, why we think it's so important, especially in a democracy.
Yeah, so we'll be talking with Daniel Willingham here, I think next week, about his new book, and I've got some other questions for him as well. Hopefully he and I can get into those. And one of the things that I saw him tweet the other day, and this is, I think, relevant, I think obviously we'll talk about the four question method a little bit more as it continues in this conversation. But one of the things I've really been trying to dive into and dig into, again, I'm a very staunch advocate of inquiry and project-based learning in particular. And of course, there's just like there's the reading wars, you mentioned Emily Hanford and all of that, there's the sort of science of learning wars kind of thing. And Daniel Willingham had tweeted something about, he said, I guess the direct instruction people think I'm one of their allies or something like that, but I'm not necessarily so, and I'm butchering that completely. I'll have to make sure I look it up before I have this conversation with him, right? But I've talked with Paul Kirshner. I've talked with, I don't know if you're familiar with Zach Rochelle, but he's an instructional coach and he has a podcast, and that was actually pretty productive. I find it really interesting that you're talking about this knowledge, and I agree, knowledge is really, really important. I've had Natalie on now 3 times on the podcast, once as part of that panel. But I also am an obvious advocate of inquiry, and like a Paul Kirshner, while I think actually he's not as against inquiry as he might make it seem like, at least on Twitter and in our conversation, they basically say inquiry teaching and learning is not effective and bad for kids. So how do you all sort of reconcile that kind of argument?
No, smoking is bad for kids. Bourbon before the age of 21 is bad for kids. So early on, John and I used to say we were pedagogical agnostics. And I think we've come a little bit farther down the road from that. But the reality is we think that if you plan well, which for us now means asking and answering the 4 questions for yourself, figuring out your story, figuring out the questions you're going to ask kids to be responsible for learning how to answer in the course of your unit of study. However you do that, knock yourself out. John loves to lecture. I'm not a big fan myself. But if you're knowledge first, and by the way, I'm a part of a team of 9th grade teachers. We trained with the Buck Institute. We built our course around project-based learning, thematic units, the whole thing. There is a place, if you exclude direct instruction on ideological grounds, you probably will be hurting kids. Because for some kids, the acquisition of knowledge necessary to find any of the inquiry questions interesting and comprehensible, I personally don't see as a classroom teacher how all of your students will do that if you just say, here you go, help yourselves.
Right.
And by the way, I teach in an affluent suburban district. 60% of my kids can do it. They don't need me. I have an absence day. I come back. They're good. I left them documents. They're great. But it's not fair to say, I can't tell you things that are true and interesting in a clear way. Like, why would you rule that out?
Right.
Yeah, well, and so so there's a fairness piece. I mean, I teach in an urban charter school where it's a very different student population, and if you just threw it open to inquiry, my kids would really struggle. So there's a fairness piece, but there's also the 4-question method guides the inquiry by defining it for kids, right? We start with a story, but we don't stop there, right? The story is what cues the inquiry, right? Like, how can you know you're curious about ancient Crete if you don't know anything about ancient Crete.
Right.
Right. I mean, I was a student teacher in a public school in Providence, Rhode Island, and I was teaching ninth grade. And there was this one ninth grade boy, African American boy, not a great reader. He was really into ancient Crete, and he just really liked the ancient Greeks, and and he would stay after school to tell me all about it. Well, there's a lot of great questions you can ask about ancient Crete. Well, what were they thinking when they built it that way, and why did it succeed so spectacularly at that time, but then it fell, right? And so we don't see knowledge and inquiry as opponents at
Right.
all. Right? The knowledge is the seedbed for the inquiry. And what we can do with our method is make that inquiry efficient, effective, and, give kids a pathway when they have curiosity. We can help them, shape that curiosity in a productive way.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that I totally agree with you, I have been trying to hammer that point and talk about that. We talk about that in our workshops. I mentioned I was in Wyoming working with teachers on inquiry to set up some project-based learning work and talking about, all right, so direct instruction is important, and inquiry exercises and activities are important. Collaborative learning activities are important, but they all serve, at least in part, some different roles, right? Like, there are things that are best taught by direct instruction. I think that's pretty clear. But then there are things, like I would say it's necessary but not sufficient in terms of larger, big picture conceptual understanding and abstract ideas. And, are there ways in which when you talk with teachers about maybe that distinction and how to know when to use direct instruction or collaborative learning activities or inquiry activities, that this is when you would use this is when you would use this is sort of a general rule. There might be some exceptions, blah blah blah, but as a general rule, here's sort of a sort of structure or framework for when to use those kinds of things.
Well, so we keep saying, so if we had a T-shirt, if we had swag T-shirts, we'd send you one, but we don't. But we can describe it to you anyway. It would say story first on the front. It would say, what's the question on the back? Mm-hmm. So you can't intuit a story. You cannot intuit what happens in other times and places. Somebody has to tell you. You have to learn it somewhere. And your teacher can tell you, a reading can tell you, a reliable reading, a video, podcast, right? But you have to listen to somebody. I mean, imagine sitting around the campfire. Somebody's got to tell you the story of the ancestors. Right. You cannot intuit it. And if you try to intuit it, you're just going to reconstruct your own world and obscure the past and other people, right? So that's where direct instruction is most crucial. And I like the image of the seed bed. Stuff's going to grow there, but not if you don't have soil. And if the soil's too thin, not much is going to grow. So it does take, and we're telling people all the time, you have to slow down for question one for two reasons. You have to reach a critical mass of knowledge before kids can really get interested. They got to meet the people making the story, and they probably have to meet them a few different ways and a few different times before they're like, oh yeah, what were they thinking? But so the story seeds the inquiry, right? But the other thing is you have to check to see if they actually got it. So one of the critiques of direct instruction, which is right, is it may lead you to overlook the very important role of formative assessment. It's not necessary. It's just a hazard for normal humans. But if you tell them a story because they can't learn it any other way, the next thing you have to do is figure out if they know the story. Right. And it's the same skill. If you lecture well, you're about a story, you're narrating, right? And then you got to see if they can do that back, because it's the narrative structure that conveys the information. It's not just a list of events or a list of facts and figures or dates. That's the canard launched against direct instruction all the time. You're just having kids memorize dates. No. We're trying to figure out a pattern of human interaction or a very specific series of events. This one did that, and that one did that, and one thing led to another. If they can't put those things in sequence as a set of human actions, they don't know the story, even if they know the dates and the names, right? And so direct instruction and formative assessment do seem like they have a natural home in question one, the seed bed. What's the story? I'll tell it to you. You tell it to me. We've got it. Now that's the launching pad for a whole set of inquiries. The second thing you have to do, the reason why what's the question is on the back, part of why we're not huge fans of C3 is they haven't specified the questions that will direct inquiry and make it productive. There's a lot of fudging around the questions. A lot of the questions you see in model C3 units, you see them in SHEG materials, Stanford History Education Group. You see a lot of questions that are actually unanswerable or ambiguous, which tells us they're not taking those inquiries seriously. They don't expect kids to actually answer those questions. The reason we have 3 very specific questions that we launch from the story is we think there are there are 3 different inquiry paths you can take. And you got to know which one you're taking and how to answer it well.
And I think the questions 2, 3, and 4, look, you could do everything with direct instruction. We don't really advise that. Question 2 is interpretation. Kids are going to read a primary source, or they're going to interpret a pattern of behavior, or look at an artifact and try to say, all right, what was the person who made that thinking? Well, that's a great opportunity for kids to talk together and for people to offer competing interpretations. What is it about the artifact or the text that leads you to that interpretation? Question 3, why then and there? Those are hard questions to answer, and we're writing curriculum that provides a kind of a hands-on database puzzle, data set puzzles, and those are another great collaborative opportunity. Question 4 really lends itself well to seminar discussion. What do we think about that? I think this is right. I think this is wrong. What makes you think so? And so, again, we're pedagogical agnostics, but the questions 2, 3, and 4 really open up a lot more student-centered opportunities, we think, than question 1.
So in the first chapter of the book, you just referenced the C3 social studies standards, and also talk about essential questions and was it Jay McTeague and Grant Wiggins. And as I mentioned before we started recording, Grant Wiggins is somebody that we have quite a bit of his writing on our Teach Thought site, and I think there's lots of value to understanding by design and essential questions, and I think, as you acknowledge in the first chapter, there's lots of value in both C3 and the UBD sort of framework, but you've identified some, I guess, shortcomings you feel with C3, and I think the essential questions in the UBD framework is really helpful, but when I think about it in a sort of project-based learning framework, what I think about is essential questions are often sort of teacher questions. Sometimes students are interested in them and might find them to be interesting and might even pose them just naturally as a curiosity, but they're not what I would say is a driving question, which is, let's create something, figure out what we need to know and learn in order to do that, and then through the project we're doing sort of the middle pieces of Bloom's taxonomy for just as a simple framework of like we're going to analyze it, we're going to work, as you all might say, interpret, right, that those critical thinking pieces. And so giving the students opportunities to help with your modeling, identify what it is we need to know, because to me that's a really, really important skill to build in life, academic or non-academic. But those essential questions, often teachers will say, here's a driving question, right? Does war bring peace, or something like that? Where
yes, always.
And I would say, well, that's an essential question that might show up on a need to know list if you have a really good driving question. So that's sort of my critique of, or one of my critiques of that sort of framework. What is, I guess, flesh out your critiques of that sort of UBD, and, if you want to say more about C3 framework as well.
Gary, why don't you talk about UBD and I'll talk about C3.
Okay, yeah. John's going to calm down while I talk about that. Yeah. So we get ourselves worked up about this. So war always leads to peace unless it never ends. So there are okay, I'm not going to talk about C3. One of the best workshops I ever went to was with Grant Wiggins. He was in Massachusetts. He died tragically shortly thereafter. Mm-hmm. He seemed young and healthy to me, but reminder. Anyway, really smart guy, and really, the integrity was manifest.
Right.
And the workshop he did was, actually, he did this amazing thing. We have a state test in Massachusetts called the MCAS, which I happen to think is a good idea. And the there's a lot of controversy because testing does crowd out our subject in elementary school. We think that's a mistake. We don't think it should. We think social studies in elementary schools are a really important thing to teach kids. But what Grant did was he put up questions from the MCAS, and he had everyone in the audience, mixed opinions. Some people liked the MCAS, some people hated the MCAS. And he says, here's a question from the English test, here's a question from the math test. And we went through those questions, and at the end he said, you think kids ought to be able to know how to do that? Everyone in the room was like, yeah, actually they should. And so it was just one of those great moments of teaching where you demonstrate, you look at what you're actually talking about and you say, should kids be able to do that? And we all agreed they should. So it reinforced the fact we need to know what we want kids to learn. We have to commit to it, and we have to drive toward it. So that's the spirit, I think, of UBD. He in a way, it makes tons of sense in the humanities because we could teach a million different things. You tell me to teach the American Revolution, I could teach a million different things about that, right? And so what understanding by design says is figure out what you want kids to know and then try to make it interesting for them. Give them a question that drives curiosity, that makes them want to know it. And by the way, that question is going to tell you at the end whether you learned it or not. You know how you'll know? If you can answer the question well. So it's a razor, right? It's like if the question demands that knowledge, it's in. If the question doesn't demand that knowledge, it's out. It's great, and it connects to curiosity. So John and I are 110% behind that concept. Here's the problem. In social studies, there are disciplinary questions. The reason why social studies is the hardest is because we actually have to deal with different disciplines. Narrative historians are telling stories all the time. We need to teach kids how to do that. Some part of the historian's work and all of the political theorists' work is interpretation, figuring out in historical context what people who said things, wrote things, produced meaningful artifacts, what they were thinking. That's what we're doing. That's a different discipline from narrative history. Again, as a political theorist, that's what I did all the time. What was Thomas Hobbes thinking in 1651 when he published Leviathan, anonymously, by the way? Question 3. Under question 3. Under what conditions, the general version of it is this is what you studied, Drew, this is what I studied, political science. When do parties realign? When do democracies have crises? When do wars break out? These are the general principles. It's a generalizing question. By the way, I think this is what Wiggins and McTighe wanted. They wanted the generalizing questions so they would transfer, right? Unit to unit, you could connect them. Question 3 is the version of that social scientists do. So question 3 is our social science question. It's not just why did this happen then and there and not in some other time and place, but why do things like this happen? It generalizes. Question 4, when is it okay to kill? Like that is a classic judgment question. What do we think about that? They made a revolution. They killed people. Under what conditions do we think that's okay? So again, if we can come up with a good answer to that, it will be generalizable. It will invoke principles that will apply not just to this case, that's cherry picking, but will apply to all cases, right? Well, if it's okay to kill in the name of revolution or rights under those circumstances, it ought to be okay somewhere else. Adjust your principles if not. So I think what Wiggins and McTighe were aiming at was what we now call question 3 and 4. The generalizing questions of our method. Under what conditions do things like this happen? Under what conditions do we think it's right or wrong to do these things? But what they didn't do is flesh out the architecture of thinking or the epistemology of our field. And so in practice, what you see is a lot of, I love your description, they're teacher questions. Teachers think they're cute, they're fun, they're interesting, but they're often fake. All wars lead to peace unless they're endless. It's just not, that's not what you really mean, right? What you mean is under what conditions do wars end? Under what conditions do wars break out? Like that's what international relations people study all the time. Read Foreign Affairs. They're arguing about it all the time. Like those are real questions. Those are good questions. Teach kids how to ask and answer. That's what we think. But get subject specific about it. English, they need to know their questions. Science and math is different. They actually know their questions. There's this thing called the scientific method. They have consensus on it. But in our field, it's much more complicated. Because question 2 is kind of like what they do in literature. Question 3 is kind of what they do in social science. Question 4 is kind of what ethicists do. So it's more complicated.
So, John, I know you have something to add to that, but before you do...
How did you know that?
I could see him chomping at the bit. I'm
He's going to argue with me.
Right? So, I'm wondering if you think any of that sort of disposition or sort of lack of extension of the thinking that that UBD might have characterized as the way that you characterized it might be because, as far as I know, Grant was not a social studies teacher. I think he was an English teacher, right? So I'm wondering if there is, do you feel like that is indicative of a different, again, sort of a different mindset?
I mean, I think I'll use this to segue into the C3 thing. I mean, I think that the Wiggins and McTighe were trying to write a generic book about the generic process
Right.
of discovering essential questions. And the problem is that essential questions are discipline specific. And, the example they built in their book was, I believe it was a nutrition unit, right? And, the questions that a nutritionist asks are different than the questions that a historian asks.
Right.
And so to try to define essential questions in a way that is transferable across fields, we don't think it's really doable. And so the concept is correct. The problem is that the questions themselves are discipline specific, and we figured out what they are for social studies. And, so C3 tried to sort of solve that problem by creating, an inquiry process for social studies. And so in that sense, it's a good effort. The problem with C3 is that they have no definition for their questions. They call them compelling questions and supporting questions. But there's no epistemological definition. There's no clear distinction between what makes something compelling and supporting. And if you dig around on the web, you find things that they're all metaphors. Well, compelling questions are meaty. Oh, okay. What does that mean? And when you go to the C3 and they say, here's our inquiry builder, if you're a teacher, there's no practical guidance about what makes something a compelling question or a supporting question. I've worked with an elementary teacher who was designing a social studies unit, and she went to the C3 website. She was like, this doesn't help me as a practical matter. And so, we've been talking about this, does war lead to peace? There's a C3 unit on the Versailles Treaty, and the compelling question is, does peace lead to war? Which is a cute little rhetorical question. The answer is yes, every time, except when it doesn't. And so it's not a real question. And what we can do is really what they're after is the compelling questions. They want to be either question 2s or 3s or 4s. And the supporting questions can't, you have to start with question 1. You got to know what happened. But we've got a framework that actually helps teachers figure out what kinds of questions they should ask. And then the Wiggins and McTighe idea, because we're asking the same 4 questions over and over, you build the practice and you get the transfer that you want. So if you're teaching a modern world history course by the 4-question method, you teach the Russian Revolution, what happened there, right? And then you get to China and, you say, hey, it's 1949. Have we seen this before? An ideological communist party takes over a very large, mostly agricultural state and tries to build socialism. Oh, Russia, right. And so then you can see, okay, now there's a pattern, right? And it's a discipline-specific transfer that, and we think really sort of achieves the vision that Wiggins and McTighe laid out for our field.
Yeah, the framework is meant to be transparent. So one of the things that teachers have always, early on, they told us about they don't know how to make an essential question, or it's always opaque to students. Again, this is your comment about a teacher question. If you ask kids to make essential questions, they can't if all they've experienced is the classical essential question. Our students can identify question 1, 2, 3, and 4. The thinking process we go through when we plan a unit is the thinking process they go through when they answer our unit questions. And by the time they've done it a bunch, they know what those questions are. You could give them a whole bunch of sample essential questions, the old style, and they can identify question 3, question 4, or I can't figure out what that one is. That's right, because it's none of them. It doesn't really make any sense.
Well, again, we have an exemplar project for project-based learning that is meant to help sort of see, sort of transparently, like this is how one would take an idea, which in this case was, especially when the sort of single-use straw issues were, legislation was being proposed to ban them and all this stuff. So trying to take that and then use that as a vehicle to teach, and sort of building on and pulling in some of those C3. Now, to be clear, we use the standards, not the questions, but then say, all right, how do we take those and turn those into need to know questions? And to your point, one of the things that I talk about with teachers often is like, we want them to think like mathematicians or historians or whatever the case may be. And in large part, that is using the language and asking the important questions, right? So what are the questions that a historian would ask about this, or a politician would ask about this, or an activist, or, name the sort of discipline that you might be using, a social scientist or whatever. And therein lies that sort of idea for me that inquiry can be super, super powerful, because it can be such a driver of thinking, like, in this case, a social studies teacher. As a social scientist, a historian or whatever, one of the things that I talk about often is sort of the idea of pull teaching, and just as use it as a simple sort of idea to say push teaching, the straw man version of it is the lecture and no formative assessment. I joke about that, like that's a TED Talk, right? Like if you're talking and TED Talks are great, but they're informational, and the TED Talker doesn't know if you have any idea what they're talking about. So you've got to do some formative assessment and really, think about that. But the idea of pull teaching is not only are we imparting information, helping them understand the story in this case, whatever it might be, in whatever mode that might be, reading, lecture, blah, 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 but we're also trying to help them articulate what's important, right? We're pulling what's in their brain out, and so there's that shift of not only am I getting, as a teacher, what's in my head out there, but I'm also trying to get what's in their head out, so I can either correct it or say it's right, or we can use that and build upon it. And the more I kind of think about this and think about how do I operate in the world, for better or for worse, so that I am constantly, I think, and maybe this is by disposition and parental upbringing, and maybe it's a part of why I became a social studies teacher, or maybe it's circular. I became a social studies teacher and that helped me do this. But like, I am constantly trying to figure out what is in others people's head. What are you thinking? Right? And to me, that is a skill set that is, it's not unique, or that shouldn't be unique to social studies teachers. It should be all teachers, because we want to get a sense, like, what's going on in that head? What are they thinking, so that I can help them think differently, or again, build upon it. And to me, that is one of the powerful pieces of learning how to teach, like with inquiry, right? So we could do very discrete things like the 4QM or the QFT or World Cafe or Socrates, blah, 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 right? But this sort of residue that comes with the practice of this, I think, is really, really powerful in a way that doesn't often get discussed. Does that make sense?
I think you're describing metacognition, but tell me if I'm wrong.
Right, exactly.
If I want to know what's in a kid's head, so part of what I want to know is, what have I been sharing with them? Mm-hmm. And part of it, I mean, you're listening for patterns of speech. I mean, it's interesting to think about question 2. What were they thinking is for us question 2. When you know a story well, the most obvious kind of curiosity is, wait, they did what? They said what? Mm-hmm. And if you're a good teacher, you're doing that with your students all the time. They said what? Mm-hmm. Right? They wrote what on that test? That exit slip says what? But I think to get anywhere with that, I mean, we're not psychoanalyzing the kids. You can, it's fun, but that's not the goal. Mm-hmm. The teaching goal is what structures, schema, what patterns of knowledge have they acquired? Right. What do they not yet have that I want them to have? And I think if you yourself as a classroom teacher don't have a schema, don't have a framework, you will either fall back on content knowledge, how many dates have they memorized, mm-hmm. which nobody wants anymore. I mean, nobody's for that. That's a straw man, right? Mm-hmm. Nobody's just for that. Or you'll fish around for skills, but it'll be hard to say. One of the things that's really nice about this method, for me as a classroom teacher, is like, there are kids who I can now identify them, and I've told them, you are an amazing storyteller. Like I know what it is their brains are good at doing. And then there are kids where you can show them a bunch of data and they're like, they see a pattern right away. I'm like, you're really good at identifying a pattern. Like I have much more specific things to say and to see because I have a schema for understanding what it is to know our field. And I can try to transfer that to them. Is this a question 2 or a question 3? If they can say, I know they know that. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And so we've created an architecture that allows me to see better when I look at my students.
Yeah. And it allows them to see better too. I mean, one of my favorite compliments that we've ever gotten was from a 10th grade student. And I do student evaluations twice a year, and this kid wrote a comment, the 4-question method makes history more clear and helps me think. And it's like, that's what we want. And, we want to give teachers and students this same schema. And, this is another important point, Drew, you were talking about thinking about, what are other people thinking and helping kids with project-based learning. Mm-hmm. And, the 4-question method is the same for adults as it is for kids. And when you prepare to teach a 4-question method unit, you ask and answer the 4 questions for yourself, and you coach your kids to do the same thing. And so when we're working with teachers, if we're working on a 3rd grade unit, nobody has to pretend to be a 3rd grader. We're going to talk like adults about these really interesting questions that the 3rd graders are going to talk about as 3rd graders. But they're interesting questions all the way up and down. And, if kids get practice with them, then, if you're going to do PBL, you're going to do project-based learning. If it's going to be a project in history and social sciences, you mentioned the straws. All right. Well, so what do we need to know? Well, what happened with the straws? The people who want to ban the straws, what are they thinking? Right. And the people who don't want to ban the straws, what are they thinking? And why are we even talking about this now? What's the context for this big argument about straws of all things? Right. And then, ultimately, well, what do we think about that? I know what these people think. I know what those people think. Now it's time for me to arrive at a judgment. Am I for this? Am I against it? And by the way, why? And you can only get that level of seriousness after you've taken the first 3 questions seriously.
Yeah, by the way, in my department, everybody writes all the students write a research paper in 9th, 10th, 11th grade. That's very common. And this is a framework for a research paper, which is an inquiry project, right? Pick your question. First thing you need to do, get the story. Second thing, figure out what the actors in the story think. What John just described. You work your way through the process. Question 1, 2, 3, and 4. And 4 is the payoff. You're going to go out in the world and deal with history that hasn't happened yet. Maybe you'll make it. So the framework works for that.
Well, I would agree, although with the qualifier that in project-based learning can fall into this trap as well. A research paper or a project can turn into sort of essentially a research paper, just sort of a reporting of facts, right? And not getting to that 4th question of what do we think about that? Like what's my interpretation here? Not just their interpretation, but my interpretation, and why is that important, and all of those things. And I think that is unfortunately what I guess you think about the sort of poor versions of teaching, and that is one that I think we have to help teachers understand, like not just a recitation of facts. But so one of the blog pieces that I have written, and it was somewhat, I think, resonant with a piece that I saw in the Heterodox Academy in email that they had shared about your method, was sort of I talked about navigating uncomfortable ideas, like we should teach uncomfortable things, and here's how. And I leaned heavily into the work of Jonathan Rauch and Constitution of Knowledge, and sort of the constitutional ideals as well. And certainly some of that is about being willing to hear things that might be uncomfortable and hard or against your opinion, which of course is, at least according to the news and social media, happening at large, and people are really struggling with it. Even, let's say, governors are struggling with it. And so one of the question, so we start with question 1, what happened? So obviously a real challenge is having accurate materials and or using materials that might have different accounts, right? So I talked with the 1619 Education Project folks, and as I've said before, like I don't agree with that central question that or the sort of thesis that we should say 1619 is the founding of the country, but it's a heck of a question to consider. And I haven't seen the Hulu thing. I haven't read the books or the materials in depth, but we do, I guess, how do you all think about helping, using any of this and any of these sort of history methods, but this one in particular, obviously it's yours. You've got to have accurate, full accounting, and that can be a real challenge insofar as textbooks may not have that, and your community may not want you to have access to that.
Yeah, so I would say two things. First, one of the ways that we can help with this challenge of tough topics is just by being clear about what are we talking about? What question are we examining? What question are we currently disagreeing about? Right? And all the questions can be contested, right? It's rare that we have absolute complete, we've got the answer to question one beyond the shadow of a doubt. Even if we can agree on a lot of things, there's stuff in the past that's just unknowable. But you mentioned 1619 Project. The big argument among historians there was a question two, and because some of the people who wrote the 1619 Project asserted that American revolutionaries were motivated by a desire to preserve slavery.
Right.
This is a question too. What were they thinking? And then a bunch of established historians, including Leslie Harris, who actually was a college classmate of mine, but they went out and they said, you know what? We just don't see enough evidence that that's what people were thinking. We don't think that was a main motive for the revolutionaries. So just by clarifying, look, this is what we're arguing about. Okay, so interpretation of the past or of the present, what are people thinking? We believe that's amenable to the rules of evidence, right? We can look at what people say and do and try to interpret what's in their heads. And we think that's a legitimate area of inquiry. Right. So, the first thing is just being clear about the nature of the disagreement. And this actually, in our experience, brings down the heat in the classroom and sort of increases the light, if you will. So that's one good approach. We actually just put up a blog post yesterday about a teacher who's teaching AP government in an urban charter school in Brooklyn, and he did a series of lessons on gun control, and he gave kids 4 readings, 2 pro, 2 anti, with different justifications, and the first task was just question 2. He said, I'm not interested in your position on gun control. What are these 4 people thinking? And let's just slow down and hear them out. Then we'll go to our, a question about question 4.
Yeah, well, it's obviously becoming more and more tricky, and even some of those methods that I think you and I would agree are really useful, important, like let's look at that evidence and consider all of those sort of viewpoints. And when you say, like, what makes them say that? Why would they have that position? There are some parties, and to me it's really hard to figure out how widespread this is. I'm skeptical that it's as widespread or as big a problem as seems to be reported by certain activists and media outlets. But there is an element of saying, well, those methods are, they're outdated, they are white supremacist, they are objectivist, or, some other labels. And I don't expect the 4QM method to solve all of those problems, but it is a really sort of tricky conundrum in how we think, and I do think that there's some sense of erosion or danger of erosion of some of the foundational principles of how we operate in this country in the best of ideal circumstances, right? That's the sort of the liberal science approach of, like, let's actually hear all of the relevant opinions and look hard at the evidence with a mind that is open enough to be willing to change your mind if, in fact, the evidence points you at that direction, instead of saying, as I think one of you said, indoctrination earlier, of saying, this is the truth, right? And I think there are versions of that that sort of truth that has been sold over the years that might come from either left or right pole. And again, I'm just sort of soapboxing at this point. I'll stop my filibuster, but like the idea that we should consider all of those things seems to me to be something we have to preserve. So feel free to respond to any of that or ignore it all.
So I think we can make social studies education better. I don't think we can resolve the problem of polarization in American society. I think you're right. There are people who have abandoned the Enlightenment project. Making argument based on evidence with an open mind.
Right.
The inherent skepticism of that project, like we think this is true, but we don't really know.
Right.
Like you have to be comfortable with that. But by the way, I mean, to your aside, which I think is really important, the Twitter universe, the media universe, the fragmented media. If you want attention in our world, you need to say something outrageous.
Right.
If you say something hesitant and skeptical and balanced, and on the one hand, on the other hand, you're unlikely to get a lot of likes and subscribes.
Right.
So I think there's a lot of hollering out there, and it's driven by media. This is a question 3. Under what conditions do you get, loudmouth extremists getting a lot of attention? But I think there's good evidence that now is the time, given the structure of the media, the structure of the law about the media, about what there is, what Twitter's responsible for and not responsible for. We can't fix that, but we do think our conception of the purpose of social studies education is to slow down thinking enough so that it's actual thinking. Learn your subject. Take some time and get to know the people in the story you're learning about. Take some time and learn the techniques and learn enough background knowledge so you can say how the context and conditions affected that story. And then when you make your judgment, slow down enough to know what your own assumptions are. Do to yourself what you did with question 2. You want to know what George Washington was thinking when he put down a mutiny, when he chased a runaway slave? I mean, there's a lot to figure out about that guy. He's complicated. Now do it for yourself. Do it for your classmates. Do it for the people around you. If you slow down enough, like if we were successful in getting everybody to slow down, Twitter would look different. Facebook would look different. I'm under no illusions that will happen anytime soon. Because the structures that drive polarization are not located mostly in the history classroom. They're located outside of it.
Right.
But look, we like you, we're here because we believe in inquiry, and the premise of the inquiry is that we don't know all the answers, which is why we have to practice inquiry. Right. We're committed to that.
Yeah. One of the things that is mentioned again in that first chapter that I think I had never heard of this, and I might have to steal it, and maybe even in our workshops, is a way of sort of formative assessment that as I'm understanding it, works best, and maybe it works in other questions as well, but works best with the sort of first question, which is the 4-sentence story. So I'll if I can get one of you to sort of unpack that and how you've seen that used and sort of the value of that, because I've heard we sometimes do 6-word stories, but a 4-sentence story has got a little bit of a different wrinkle.
Yeah. So when you ask kids to tell you the story, there are a lot. What makes it difficult is you have to make a lot of good decisions, and so you've got to decide what's important, what's less important, right? You've got to make sure you get things in the right order, right? And so when you ask somebody to tell you a 4-sentence story about a historical event, they have to be really thoughtful. And it's a limiting device, right? If you tell kids, tell me the story of in the introduction to our book, it's the Salem witchcraft hysteria. Tell me the story of the Salem witchcraft hysteria, and you've got 2 pages. Well, to cover themselves, they're just going to put down everything that they've heard in the last week and make sure that they mention it all.
Right.
And it becomes a big, long list, and it's just a pile of stuff, and that's not what we're after. We want people to be able to see, I'm going to make some decisions about what matters in the story, what I'm going to include, what I'm going to leave out. I have to be conscious about those decisions because I only get 4 sentences. So, and then we can assess, and then we can talk about, hey, Drew's 4-sentence story included this element. Gary's 4-sentence story left that element out. Let's talk about that. It's not that one is the correct story and the other one is an incorrect story unless there's an error. were,
Right.
right? But what did Drew decide to focus on that Gary didn't decide to focus on, and what were they thinking when they did that? Right? So that's one big thing. Another big element of the four sentence story is that we're huge fans of the Writing Revolution, which is a book and program for teaching kids to write, and it makes writing instruction really granular, extremely powerful. And as I said, I'm teaching in an urban charter school. A lot of kids who don't speak English at home. A lot of kids who don't come into high school with really great writing skills. And Writing Revolution is enormously helpful. And so we've incorporated that into our four sentence story assessments, and it's a great way not only for kids to learn and remember and practice retelling a story, but also to practice writing, which, by the way, helps tremendously with reading. And so when they learn to write more sophisticated sentences, they read those sentences better as well.
Well, the last question is question 4 is about sort of coming up with one's own interpretation, right? And one of the things that I highlighted that I thought was interesting insofar as the collaborative conversations that I'm imagining are sort of forced by this is, question 4 asks what we think, not just what I think. And, again, I can imagine, and I have always been a proponent of trying to get kids to have that negotiation, right? Like, how do we decide what everybody should get in a project as far as who did what and accountability and points and scores and things like that. But in this case, it's more about concepts and ideas. So why is the we important more so than the I here?
So it's a civic conception, but it's also, just true to how people make up their minds about things. If you're teaching teenagers, you will never forget that we are a gregarious species, that we take our cues from other people. So, you can be an Ayn Rand fan or go out and live in a hut in the woods, but you're still socialized among the rest of us. And so the conception built in here is that, first of all, students, everyone, will decide based on their knowledge of all the opinions around them. And the civic responsibility, if you're going to live in a democracy, is you got to make an argument in public, and you got to be willing to listen and make your argument and listen to other arguments in public. And so the classroom's a laboratory. We call them inquiry labs. Question 2 inquiry lab, question 3 inquiry lab, and so on. Question 4 is you're going to try some arguments out in public, and you're going to listen to people respond. And then we're going to dig in and talk about the assumptions that drive those arguments, theirs and yours. And then we're going to assume that we're all committed to getting the best judgments we can out of this process. In the end, I'll own mine and you own yours, but not until it's been through the crucible of argument and disagreement. Not until I've actually listened and heard, you think gun control is a bad idea? I think it's a good idea. I now understand the argument of somebody who thinks differently than me, and they understand the argument from my point of view. That's the civic training we expect. And it also reflects the fact that we live in society. We formulate our ideas in society. We're just providing structure for what happens in a very informal, I'm listening to my Twitter feed. I'm listening to my TikTok. We're trying to take it out of the shadows and make it the object of procedure. We're together in this, people. And by the way, gun control is a policy that will apply to all of us. You can decide what kind of ice cream you want. That's not my business. But when we're discussing questions that are about our common life, we need to discuss them in common. And that's why the question is, what do we think about that? It's not that you don't get to decide in the end. It's not that we can't disagree. We are, again, not indoctrination, inquiry. But the inquiry has structure. And it's got to have structure, or it's just, I like chocolate, I like vanilla. And that's not productive.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note, what do we think about that isn't a call for consensus and agreement. It's not, we all think the same thing about gun control at the end of our week. No, that's not the aim. The aim is to understand each other. So what do we think about that? Gary's against it, I'm for it, and I understand why he's against it. I understand what his assumptions are and what his purpose is. I don't share those assumptions, so I've come to a different judgment than he did. But we're in it together, and I think that like Gary said, that's the democratic model.
Right. So again, we've got the 4Q method, right? So you've got 4 questions, and it is a framework, and I love the framework. I love the idea. And I'm also wondering, just like with anything, right? When you repeat it and then, you know, even ice cream gets boring after a while. Is there any, or have you, experienced in, or any, or had teachers talk about like sort of that repetition exhaustion, or no?
No. So, by the way, I just have to check your premise there, Drew. Ice cream does not get boring. And one of the reasons ice cream does not get boring is because it's not just vanilla. So, we're doing a story again? No, it's not like that. We're learning a different human story with different humans in it, with different ideas driving it, with different patterns underlying it, with different judgment questions to consider. The framework would be boring if all we did was teach the skills. This is relevant to the reading debate. You know what's boring? Learning reading strategies is boring. But reading is not boring because the stories are different, right? It would be like saying, I read 3 books. I don't read anymore. I know how it goes. You know, boy meets girl, blah, blah, blah. Like, it's not like that, right? People read voraciously because every story is different, and every story engages you in a slightly different way. The story of the Cold War is very different from the story of Hammurabi. If you're bored by either one, probably the story isn't being told to you very well. Ice cream is awesome. Any time of year, by the way. We're in New England. Any time of the year.
The skills of 4 questions, it's not like math, right? It's not like question 1 is subtraction. And like, once I've done subtraction, I'm going to do 10 more subtraction problems. And the numbers don't matter. It's the same process over and over, right? You know, it's different because the content is different. And so content matters, right? And, you know, it's just like Gary said, like, yeah, we're going to tell a lot of stories. We're going to start with Hammurabi. We're going to end up with, you know, Xi Jinping and, you know, and the current, you know, relation with China. There's a million different stories in there. So no, it never gets dull. You know, Drew, you like to figure out what other people are thinking. You know, that doesn't get dull for you because there's always new people, right? And the same for us with history.
Rum raisin, mint chip.
Well, what does because you work with teachers on this, and there's a workshop and perhaps some other ways in which you're helping educators. What does that look like most typically, or in most cases?
So we've got sort of 2 projects that we work on. One is we help teachers. We do professional development, and you know we have a book, and we do workshops based on the book, and we do those remotely. We do those in person, and you know, and that's great. One of the things that we found is that what we're doing a lot more of now is we're starting to write curriculum, because actually giving teachers 4QM aligned units makes it much easier for them to implement the method, and it makes everything easier for everybody. So we've been working with a school in Nashville called Nashville Classical Charter School, and we've been writing elementary grade curriculum for them based on core knowledge, history, and geography materials. And so we're trying to build that project out. We also are talking about building out an AP World course and providing curriculum materials for that. And so I think our ultimate vision is we'd love to be able to have, you know, a open educational resource for QM curriculum that people can download and use, and then we'll run workshops and help people, you know, people make the most of it, help people make it work.
Is the workshop typically 1 day, 2 day, 3 days, 6 months? Ice cream every day, every meal.
We start with rum raisin. We go to moose tracks.
So we've done a lot of different things. You know, we do 1 day workshops. You know, people often use storyboards after a 1 day workshop. I'm not sure how much farther the needle moves. We've had long-term clients. That's been much more satisfying, frankly. We worked with the Uncommon Schools for 2 years. We're working with an independent school in North Carolina. We just got back from there. They're doing terrific curriculum work, and we're going slowly and deeply, and that's very rewarding.
Yeah.
But so here's the problem. What we just told you about today, these 4 questions, it's a discipline. It's an intellectual framework. You have to internalize it. And we also, you know, we're pretty big on story first. You got to know your material well.
Right.
So if you're a new teacher, you got to know your material well. You have to learn an intellectual framework that you haven't learned in grad school or undergrad or wherever. These guys are telling you about it. A 1 day workshop isn't going to do it. Right. You got to practice, like anything. You got to practice. So a new teacher is not going to be able to do this curriculum without assistance. A veteran teacher, you know, you run into the problem, I worked really hard to make my curriculum. It works pretty well.
Right.
I don't get complaints. No parents are not calling.
Right.
Drew, I'm betting you did a pretty good job in your work, right? So but you're also clearly driven by the passion to get better, right? Like you have the bug, right? This is your life. So there are 5% of the people who go to our workshops who come out like, I'm rewriting everything. We talk to those people. We hear from them. They're like, this is great. I'm doing this.
They're like, hey,
I am starting again because this is so
Evangelists.
awesome. Yeah, and they're like conversion. Yeah, they've converted. But most people are like, look, it's a job. My stuff is pretty good. I don't get complaints. Yeah, I see that. I can use a storyboard. Maybe I'll use the template or the rubric. But they're not going to rewrite their stuff. And so that made us think, well, wait a minute. The people who would use it either can't or probably won't. But if we give it to them, the new teacher now has this material and can start with it. Yeah. And the logic is built into the lessons and units and assessments. And the veteran teacher who wants to try it doesn't have to throw stuff out. They can start from something, not from nothing. Right. And so it overcomes that resistance. Oh my God, you know how hard I worked on this in the first place?
Right.
So I think the future for us, we'll continue to talk to people. PD, we love being with people.
We love doing the workshops.
We love it.
It's great to meet teachers, and it's great to work with teachers, and we'll work with anybody. What's your budget? How much time do you have? We'll figure it out. Like we've done a lot of good stuff, but
the curriculum will make it better.
The curriculum will make it better.
Gotcha. Well, what, if anything, have we not talked about that we should? And if there isn't anything to add to that list, where should folks find you and all of those wonderful marketing kinds of things?
I love the marketing.
WorkUMteaching.net. WorkUMteaching.net is our website. From there, you can find a little video that has us being cheeky and describing our method. You can find testimonials and a link to our book. You can find a blog section.
Yeah, we should say more about the book. We actually have a book. We wrote a book. It's called From Story to Judgment: The 4-Question Method for Teaching and Learning Social Studies.
John Catt US.
John Catt US. John Catt is a British publisher, but they've got a US branch, and they picked us up. And so we encourage you to, if you're interested, we encourage you to read the book, buy the book. But yeah, the website is really where all 4QM teaching things currently live. And you can email us at, we actually have 2 email addresses. Which one should we use, Gary? Should we use them both?
The website has an email address. The easiest thing is just go to the website, 4QMteaching.net, and you find all the information there. It's all written down.
And I think you have Twitter, right? Any other social media?
On Twitter.
Yep. At 4QM Teaching, and that's our only social media presence right now.
Well, no, we're on LinkedIn, though not actively. Right?
We're on LinkedIn under our names.
That's
Jonathan
where the action.
Basset and Gary Shiffman.
LinkedIn is where the action takes place.
Yeah.
So, okay, well, John and Gary, it's been a real pleasure. I would definitely recommend folks check into this. I think again, I'm a history, social studies teacher and inquiry advocate, so this is right up my alley. But I can imagine how powerful and helpful it would be in a number of the ways that we've talked about, but more as well. So we'll make sure we put things in the show notes. Folks, check them out and reach out to them and message them on LinkedIn with great messages, and we'll go from there. So thanks so much for your time.
Thanks for having us, Drew.
Thank you, Drew. Thanks for having us on.
Thanks again so much for listening. I really do appreciate it. If you found this conversation to be useful, thought-provoking, or something that's worth commenting on and sharing, please do so with your friends, your social networks, and leave reviews where you listen to your podcasts. It's really helpful for our podcast and hopefully for anybody that you might share it with. And of course, please visit us at wegrowteachers.com if you have questions about our professional development, or email me at drew@teachthought.com.